Shalom to my brothers and sisters who are in the body of Yahushua HaMashyach, which is called the bride. And shalom to the scattered Hebrew Israelites who are throughout the four corners of the earth. Today, this video shall expose the lies of Vocab Malone, who called himself a Christian apologetic, for he did a documentary about our history to disprove that we are the children of Israel, which we know is a lie. However, our brothers who are Israelites did a video to show you the whole truth of the matter and to give you the correct history. You can find it on Hebrew Nation Building channel. They did 2 videos. One is dealing with Reform Apologetics, Destroyed, and then they did another one, which is part 2. Their video link will be listed in the video description box, as well as both Vocab Malone video link shall be listed in the description box. Also, Yahuwah prophetic message shall be listed in the description box or the pinned comment section, because he now is speaking himself, letting you know who are the Israelites and who are the Gentiles. So my family, sit back and watch the lies of Vocab, because your mouth is going to drop. And remember to preach the gospel that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, for this is the Messiah. This is the season for the Messiah to return. For we are in the 7th day of Adam, which is the 12,000 year creation. Read 2 Ezra chapter 7 and Matthew chapter 24. Make sure the people receive salvation as written in Romans chapter 10 and baptize them in the name of Yahushua HaMashyach. For the Lamb set the example of the water and of the Holy Spirit baptism, and the apostles continued. Now you shall watch Vocab video. It is 2 hours and 27 seconds long. The title of his video is Documentary, Black Hebrew Israelite Debunk. And notice how he used the term Black Hebrew Israelites, for he do not believe that the Negroes are the children of Israel. For in the video description box, his video was published on December 26, 2016 AD. And it says that this film critically examined the history and doctrine of the Black Hebrew Israelites. Now sit back and watch the lies of Vocab. And then when you watch Hebrew Nation Building video in comparison, you're going to see what his true agenda is, for he is trying to stop the awakening. But it shall not work to his favor. It shall work against him. For we are the children of Israel.
All you crackers, man.
That's right.
Punks, man.
That's right.
You want to back your head, man.
That's right.
Oh, they're young. They're young. Now I want to take these babies and hell, you got eat you devils, man.
A modern religious phenomenon has taken place in the United States. Black African men have formed groups claiming they are the true Israelites, and that the Ashkenazi Jews in Israel and abroad are imposters. There are different black Israelite splinter groups. Some believe Jesus is the Messiah, and others do not. Some claim the white man is the devil and cannot be saved, and others do not. But what they all agree on is they are supposedly the true Israelites of the Bible. In this film, we will refute the biblical and historical claims of these groups. In 1960, an African American named Eber Ben Yamyan, also known as Abba Bivens, formed a black Israelite school in New York City. There he started teaching the idea that Jesus was a black man, and that African Americans and Native Americans were the true Israelites. Prior to his death in 1973, he appointed Moshe Ben Karim, also known as Mashah, as well as Peter Sherrod, also known as Yacob, to take over leadership of this school. The school would become known as ISUPK, or Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge. Prior to joining this new school, Peter Sherrod, or Yacob, claimed to have learned blacks were the true Israelites from an angel in a bar in the Midwest. He claimed this angel appeared as a man and had a perfect afro, told him blacks were the Israelites, left the bar, and then when Yacob ran outside to catch him and talk some more, the angel mysteriously vanished without a trace. This is interesting because leaders of many cults and false religions often purport to have encounters with angelic beings who lead them to create their false systems. For example, Muhammad claimed the angel Gabriel appeared to him to start Islam. Joseph Smith claimed the angel Moroni appeared to him to start Mormonism, and Benjamin Krem claimed an angelic figure appeared to him to create his version of the false New Age movement. But, as 2 Corinthians 11:14 warns, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Later in the 1970s, 5 more black men were added to the leadership of the school, so that the group was headed by the 7. This group then adopted the teaching of reincarnation. They claimed their leader Mashah had several reincarnations as Moses, King David, and the Apostle Peter. It also taught that one of its leaders, Ariah, was John the Revelator, reincarnated, etc. They said this because Ariah was the one who came up with a lot of black Hebrew Israelite doctrine. Now, as time passed, the leaders Mashah and Ariah had a falling out. Some of the members of ISUPK attempted a coup against Mashah and even put a hit out on him in the streets. So, Mashah left the group and started the House of David School. Ariah remained at ISUPK, and one of the members of that group, named Tazadakia, ended up making the insane and heretical claim that he was actually the promised Comforter, or Holy Spirit, of John 14 in the flesh. He changed the name of ISUPK into the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ, or ICGJC, due to some failed prophecies which embarrassed the group. We will cover those false prophecies shortly. Now, Ariah, the one who made the false prophecies, remained with this renamed ICGJC group, supporting Tazadakia's claim of being the Holy Spirit. Ariah also ended up denying the virgin birth of Jesus, and claiming that the beginning of the Gospel of Luke was a forgery, since it affirms that doctrine. Their ICGJC group also denies the doctrine of the Trinity. General Yohana was part of this renamed ICGJC group, but ended up leaving and creating another group, which retained the original ISUPK name. His group still exists today and is quite large. Another ICGJC member named Elder Rashah also left the group after the aforementioned failed prophecies and created the Gathering of Christ Church School, or GOCC, which still exists today. This group says that Gentiles like whites can be saved, while the other schools say they cannot. Now, Tahar, who was a leader of the House of David splinter group, which was at odds with the original ISUPK group, started teaching the false doctrines that the Gentile Cornelius in the book of Acts was actually an Israelite, and that the black Hebrew Israelites could rape young girls based on a distortion and misunderstanding of Deuteronomy 22.
So what happens when one of y'all feels so overwhelmed by the Spirit of God that when you see one of each other's daughters, you just grab her up? You gonna tell one of these brothers here, come on, you know the doctrine. You know how we get when you get...
Well, answer it.
We just told you that...
But if it did happen,
But if it did happen, you would allow it to happen. Why? Because you go back to the scriptures.
You're supposed to be a brother.
Hold on. You're going to allow one of your brothers to rape your daughter.
Yes, man.
When the kingdom is established, we're going to get women when they 12 years old.
Right.
All right? Say it again. Question. Have sex with them. Have babies, man.
With 12-year-olds.
Brother, this in the kingdom, we're going to do that, man. We're going to get them young.
This caused major divisions and arguments within the House of David school he was a part of. Dahar was therefore kicked out and formed his own group called Great Millstone Israelites, or GMS, which still exists today. Moreover, according to former members, people within the House of David group accused its leader Mashah of dabbling in Satanism, Kabbalah, and the incantation of demons. They said he was trying to control demons and get them to go after his enemies. They say this might have been due to dementia and old age, however. After this, the Israel United in Christ, or IUIC, group split off from the House of David. This school is headed up by people like Elder Nathaniel and was created in 2003. You will see them wearing purple. So Black Hebrew Israelites are indeed a fragmented group with a wide array of different camps and beliefs. As for the false prophecy we mentioned earlier that led to the original ISUPK group to change its name, that is important to discuss. Various leaders of ISUPK, such as Ariah, falsely predicted Jesus was going to return in the year 2000 and murder and enslave all white people.
God is going to send his decree in these last days, and that is to totally annihilate America. America will be blown off the face of the earth by the year 2000. It's talking about Judgment Day.
These places that's going to be hit in this thermonuclear war is America. America's going to be wiped off the face of the planet Earth. That's going to take place before the year 2000.
That's right.
America has less than 628 days before this country is taken out and thermonuclear destruction.
See, America is going to be destroyed before the year 2000 by thermonuclear destruction.
When examining the history of this movement, we see its foundations were bad. And as Matthew 7:17-18 says, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. End quote. This movement is indeed a bad tree. Fake black Israelites teach that unless you are an African American Negro belonging to the tribe of Judah, or a member of one of the other tribes, you cannot be saved. Therefore, it is important to prove the ancient Israelites were not Negroes to refute this theology. Fake black Israelites claim they descend from Noah's son Shem. Shem's son Arphaxad was the ancestor of the Hebrews and Israelites. The question is if Arphaxad's later Hebrew and Israelite progeny were indeed Negroes, as fake black Israelites claim. We will demonstrate they were not. Now, Noah had another son named Ham, and Ham's son Cush was actually the true ancestor of the Negroes or Africans, including fake black Israelites of today. Ham's son Cush was the ancestor of the Cushites. The Cushites who inhabited the land of Cush were the ancient Negroes. This land also went by the name of Nubia or Ethiopia in ancient times. Although fake black Israelites quote an outdated and mistaken Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary to say that Ham did not produce the Negroes, the fact is that book nowhere says the Negroes come from Shem. In fact, this book denies that and says Shem was the progenitor of the Semitic race. And plus, modern high-level scholars affirm that Ham's son Cush was indeed the progenitor of the Negroes. For example, in his study of ancient peoples in the work From Every People and Nation, biblical scholar J. Daniel Hayes observes, the Cushites were clearly black African people with classic Negroid features. Thus, Ham's son Cush was indeed the progenitor of the Negroes. Noah's son Shem was not. The same work goes on to explain. W. Hayes writes in the Cambridge Ancient History that the art of Egypt clearly identified the Nubian Cushite group as Negro. Other physical features are discussed in the ancient sources as well. The Cushites were described as having not only black skin, but also flat noses, thick lips, and woolly hair. Notice even the African-American scholar of classics Frank Snowden agrees that it was the Cushites, that is the descendants of Ham, who were the ancient Negroes according to Egyptian art and other ancient sources. The Oxford Guide to People and Places in the Bible notes, Cush in Hebrew and Ethiopia in Greek designate the land and people of the Upper Nile River from modern southern Egypt into Sudan. The more indigenous term for this region is Nubia. Ham is another Hebrew term for the dark-hued people of antiquity. In Genesis 10, Ham is the son of Noah, who populates Africa, end quote. Ham populated Africa with Negroes. Shem did not produce the Negroes. So indeed, fake black Israelites come from Ham's son Cush. Yet, when street preaching, the fake black Israelites often criticize and distance themselves from modern-day Africans who come from Ham's son Cush as well.
Me? Why did you say that? Why did you say that you wouldn't kick my ass? You can kick my ass. If you kick me, you kick yourself.
No, but I'm not African. I'm not African. I'm not African. I'm not African. I'm not African, man. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question.
They from Israel. They from Israel. I was born in Africa, raised.
We are not African. We two separate people. The Africans are a disgusting people, man.
I need to put a picture of how disgusting African culture is, so my people would separate from Africans. My people are not African. My people are the Negroes.
Yet, as we've shown, both the African and the African American are Hamite or Cushite Negro Gentiles. Abraham, who is the father of the Hebrews and Israelites, came from the line of Shem's son Arphaxad. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were not from Cush, the ancestors of the Negroes. Instead, according to the ancient records, Abraham lived in western Mesopotamia, that is the land of the Arameans. J. Daniel Hayes gives the evidence. In Genesis 24:4 and 28:5, Abraham is associated with the Arameans. The use of Aramean in connection with Abraham probably refers to those scattered tribes of people in Upper Mesopotamia who had not yet coalesced into the nation of Aram that appears in later texts. The creed-like statement of Deuteronomy 26:5, "My father was a wandering Aramean," certainly remembers an Aramean ancestry. The text probably refers to Jacob and not Abraham. Jacob's mother and his two wives are identified as Arameans in Genesis 28:5. The Arameans Abraham and his family came from lived in settlements in what is now modern-day Syria, which is quite the distance from the area south of Egypt the ancient Negroid Cushites populated. Now, Jacob's sons formed the 12 tribes of Israel. He and his sons' families were not Negroes. Instead, as Hayes relays, although both Isaac and Jacob returned to Mesopotamia to marry Aramean women, Jacob's sons apparently do not follow this tradition. Judah marries a Canaanite woman, and then also fathers twins, Perez and Zerah, by his daughter-in-law Tamar, who is probably also a Canaanite. Genesis 46:10 indicates that Simeon likewise had a Canaanite wife. Joseph, after becoming the advisor of Pharaoh, married an Egyptian woman named Asenath, who bore him two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Thus, the biblical tradition presents the ancestors of the tribes of Israel as a mix of Western Mesopotamian, Aramean and or Amorite, Canaanite, and Egyptian, end quote. Abraham, Jacob, Judah, and Judah's Canaanite wife were thus Asiatics. In the context of ancient Egypt, Asiatic just meant beyond the borders of Egypt and Africa to the east. Here are depictions of ancient Asiatics from the tomb of Khnumhotep II from 1900 BC. Clearly they were not Negroes. Compare these Asiatic men to ancient Egyptian depictions of Negro Nubians, and you can see that they do not look the same. Also, The Egyptian Book of Gates depictions, dated to the 13th century BC, likewise demonstrate Asiatics like Abraham, Jacob, Judah, and Judah's Canaanite wife were not Negroes. What is more, the tomb of Seti I proves the same. The Asiatic people were not Negroes. Well, what about the later Israelites themselves? Hayes provides more insight into how the later ancient Israelites looked. He notes they combine the look of the current inhabitants of the Middle East with the representations of the Israelites and other Asiatic peoples in the paintings and monument carvings of the Egyptians and the Assyrians. As mentioned above, numerous Asiatics are depicted in Egyptian art from the Old Testament period. Likewise, numerous Israelites are portrayed in Assyrian sculpture. Jehu, king of Israel, along with several other Israelites, is depicted in the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. Numerous scenes portraying Israelites are included in the sculptured wall panels from Sennacherib's palace, portraying the siege of the Israelite city of Lachish. The people in these artistic portrayals are, in general, similar in appearance to the Israelis and Arabs living in and around Israel-Palestine today. Indeed, here is the aforementioned ancient Assyrian depiction of the Israelite king Jehu bowing to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III in the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, created about 825 BC. Notice the Israelite king has long straight hair and a hook nose, which is not how ancient Negroes were depicted. Ancient Cushites had flat noses and kinky hair. On the same obelisk, behind King Jehu, are a line of Israelite tribute carriers, and they are not Negro in appearance either. Notice they have straight hair on their heads and the bottom of their beards. This is how the ancient Israelites looked. They were not Negroes. Also, here is the aforementioned Lachish relief on the walls of Sennacherib's palace. These are stone panels carved around 700 BC, depicting Assyrians conquering the Israelite kingdom of Judah in the siege of Lachish. Notice how the Judean people look. They do not have Negro facial features at all. But don't some of the men in this relief appear Negro? Yes, but these were not the Judeans. These were Nubian or Cushite troops who fought side by side the Judeans to defend the town of Lachish, and were made prisoners by King Sennacherib with the Judeans. The Judeans in the relief have turbans and fringed kilts, and the Nubians do not. Indeed, here is an image showing a Judean man and his family, and then a Nubian in front of them, all being captured and led away from Lachish. The Nubian Negro is clearly different than the Judean man and his family. Thus, when fake black Israelites claim the curly-haired Nubians in the relief are the Judeans, they are deceiving people. Shem's descendants, the ancient Israelites, were not Negroes. Further evidence the ancient Israelites were not Negro can be seen in Numbers 12:1, which shows Moses' brother Aaron and his sister Miriam got upset that Moses married a Negro woman, quote, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman, end quote. Scholars note the Cushites were, as we've already noted, black Africans. For example, biblical scholar J. Daniel Hayes notes, it is clear that Moses marries a black African woman, end quote. Likewise, Yamauchi notes, the Cushite woman was no doubt dark-skinned, end quote. Hence, the reason Aaron and Miriam spoke against Moses marrying a Cushite was because she was black and the Israelites were not. If Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were all black, Aaron and Miriam would not object to Moses marrying a black woman. Therefore, the ancient Israelites, like Moses, were not black. Because of this racial prejudice against blacks from Moses' brother and sister, Numbers 12:10 goes on to tell us that God got angry and gave Miriam leprosy, turning her skin extreme ghost white as a punishment, quote, when the cloud removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam, and behold, she was leprous, end quote. This further confirms Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were not Negroes, but instead Aaron and Miriam got corrected by God for being prejudiced against Negroes. This is confirmed by Old Testament scholar and Hebraist Stephen L. Mackenzie, who in the Oxford Guide to People and Places in the Bible notes, Miriam's becoming as white as snow with leprosy seems appropriately ironic punishment for her criticism of Moses' marriage to a black woman, end quote. Hence, Moses and the Israelites were not Negroes, and the racial prejudice exhibited by Aaron and Miriam was also unacceptable. Another proof Israelites were not black or Negro is found in Jeremiah 13:23, which says, "Can the Cushite change his skin, or the leopard his spots? Then also you can do good who are accustomed to do evil," end quote. Now, if Jeremiah and the Israelites were Negroes like the Cushites, then why would the skin of the Cushites be emphasized in this peculiar manner? So if Jeremiah and the Israelites were black like Cushites, then wouldn't Jeremiah just say, "Can the Israelite change his skin?" What is more, a Jewish synagogue dated to 244 AD, located in Dura Europos, Syria, yields wall depictions of ancient Israelites, and they are brown-skinned Middle Eastern and lack Negroid features. For example, the synagogue contains the Crossing the Red Sea painting and the Ezra Reading the Law painting. These further prove the ancient Israelites were not Negro. Other depictions there, such as the King Saul anointing King David picture, also show the Israelites were brown-skinned Middle Eastern and not black Negroes. Fake black Israelites claim the ancient Egyptians were Negro, and since the Israelites, Moses, and Jesus blended in with Egyptians in two biblical stories, they claim the Israelites must have therefore been Negro too. They note in Exodus 2, Moses as a baby is abandoned by his Levite mother, put in a basket in the river, discovered by the daughter of the Egyptian Pharaoh, and then adopted by the Egyptians. Based on the false assumption the ancient Egyptians were Negro, the fake black Israelite writer Elisha Israel thus argues, "The daughters of Ruel mistook Moses for an Egyptian. Furthermore, if the Israelites appeared unlike the Egyptians, Moses would have been unable to live among the household of the Pharaoh that sought the death of all the newly born Israelite males, just as Jesus was hidden among the Egyptian population during the days of Herod," end quote. So the question is, were the ancient Egyptians Negroes? Based on examining ancient Egyptian anthropology, mummies, sculptures, paintings, and inscriptions, serious scholars have come to the conclusion the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes. For example, respected Japanese Semitic historian and ancient languages scholar Edwin M. Yamauchi notes, "Egyptians accurately depicted their enemies and their allies. They made clear color distinctions between themselves and the black Nubians, whom they rhetorically denounced with insulting epithets," end quote. Indeed, here is ancient Egyptian art, showing how Egyptians depicted themselves as light brown-skinned people, compared to how they depicted Nubians or Cushites as black-skinned Negro people. Clearly there is a difference, which proves the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes. The Hamite Cushites were. In other ancient Egyptian art, for example at the tomb of Horemheb, Nubian Negro prisoners are depicted with standard Negro features, such as larger lips and noses, while the Egyptian masters have smaller lips and noses. Moreover, a painting from the tomb of Hui shows Negro Nubians bringing tribute to the Egyptian pharaoh. Egyptians are also in the scene as chariot drivers, and the differences between the Egyptians and Nubian Negroes are clear. Notice the Negroes are darker than the Egyptians, and the Egyptians have long straight hair, which is not a Negro feature. Also, in an ancient Egyptian relief of a Nubian prisoner from the New Kingdom housed in the St. Louis Art Museum, you see how the ancient Egyptians depicted ancient Negro Nubians, and it was not the same as how they depicted themselves. What is more, the wooden chest of Tutankhamun, created between 1417 and 1379 BC, depicts the Egyptian king defeating Cushite Nubians. Clearly the Egyptian king is brown-skinned and not Negro, while the Cushite Nubians were Negroes, being a lot darker. The lips of the Cushite Nubian enemies are fuller as well. All of these depictions demonstrate the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes, and they refute the fake black Israelite appeal to the Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary, which denies Ham's son Cush was the progenitor of the Negroes. J. Daniel Hayes concluded that in the delta and northern part of Egypt, the majority of the Egyptians, quote, appeared as they are portrayed in Egyptian art, with straight black hair and light brown skin. Undoubtedly, however, there were other people in the society, both Asiatics and Cushites, who looked different but were nonetheless Egyptians, end quote. Hence, this was a mixed society, with the majority being light brown-skinned native Egyptians. In regards to this light brown-skinned majority in ancient Egypt, Professor of Old Testament Robert A. Bennett explains, quote, in terms of the physical and racial characteristics, the Egyptians of the ancient Near East were brown-skinned people with long hair, end quote. Moreover, on this brown-skinned majority, Egyptologist Anne Macy Roth notes, as we know from their observant depictions of foreigners, the ancient Egyptians saw themselves as darker than Asiatics and Libyans, and lighter than the Nubians, Negroes, and with different facial features and body types than any of these groups, end quote. Classic scholar Frank Snowden, who is an African American by the way, notes ancient Egyptians were a lot lighter than black Ethiopians, and also mildly lighter than half-breeds who lived between Egypt and Ethiopia, quote, those dwelling near the boundaries between Egypt and Ethiopia were not completely black, but were half-breeds as to color, in part not so black as Ethiopians, but in part blacker than the Egyptians, end quote. Snowden also notes the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes, but instead they depicted Nubians as Negroes, quote, though not very numerous, the realistic portrayals of blacks in early Egyptian art are sufficient to illustrate the types of Cushites known prior to the New Kingdom, and to show that Nehesu, a word used of Southerners as early as 2300 BC, included peoples with Negroid features, end quote. The 13th century BC Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II reigned during the 19th dynasty. His preserved mummified corpse shows he was not a Negro. As Egyptologist Frank Yurko notes, he is a typical northern Egyptian. He came from the northeasternmost nome of Egypt. He had fine, wavy hair, a prominent hooked nose, and moderately thin lips, end quote. In fact, the mummy of Ramses II shows he had straight, ginger hair. These are not Negro features. We also have the mummy of Thutmose IV, who reigned from 1419 to 1386 BC. He had straight long hair, untypical of ancient and modern Negroes. Now, fake black Israelites often falsely claim the Egyptian Queen Tiye was Negro, based on an ancient sculpture of her head, which they interpret to have an afro. However, that is not an afro, but instead just a kerchief headdress, known as a khat, K-H-A-T. We know this for a fact because we have the actual mummy of this Queen Tiye, and in reality, she had long, straight hair and facial features untypical of Negroes. For example, she had a hook nose instead of a flat nose, as well as smaller-sized lips. What is more, we have the mummy of King Tut's grandfather, whose name was Yuya. He was clearly not a Negro, but instead had straight hair, smaller lips, and a hook nose. This mummy evidence clearly refutes the lie the ancient Egyptians were Negro. Of relevance also is the ancient Egyptian statue of Queen Nefertiti, known as the Nefertiti bust, created in 1345 BC. Egyptologist Frank Yurko explains this as, quote, the well-known head of Nefertiti in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. There she is depicted with a blue cap-like crown and with light-colored skin. The color on the statue head is ancient, as originally applied by the sculptor, in whose studio the head was excavated. So this is how Nefertiti was actually represented in ancient times, end quote. Now, when this statue is compared to the average Negro today, or ancient depictions of Cushite or Nubian Negroes, there's a major difference. clearly Nefertiti was not a Negro. We also have the Ka statue of Hor I, who was the Egyptian pharaoh of the 13th dynasty, reigning from 1777 BC until 1775 BC. He has non-Negroid features such as blue eyes, a small nose, and small lips. Thus, the argument that Moses and Jesus must have been Negro because the ancient Egyptians were allegedly Negro is refuted by the evidence. Now yes, from 760 BC to 656 BC, Egypt was temporarily ruled by 6 Cushite or Negro pharaohs in succession. This is called the 25th dynasty or the Cushite dynasty. As Edwin Yahuwshah notes, for half a century, a Cushite dynasty, the 25th, ruled Egypt. The most important ruler of this dynasty was Taharka. W.Y. Adams comments, Taharka was the next to last Ethiopian pharaoh. These Negro rulers came from the Nubian kingdom of Cush after its king, King Kashta, invaded Egypt and took control. These 6 Negro pharaohs did not come from Egypt, so it is erroneous to point to them and claim all native Egyptians were Negro. This Negro 25th dynasty was violently toppled and deposed by the Assyrians in 656 BC, and control of Egypt was then handed back to the native Egyptians. The last of the 6 Negro pharaohs, Tantamani, fled back to Nubia after this Assyrian toppling. Egyptologist Edna N. Russman notes concerning these temporary Negro pharaohs, quote, the newcomers did not look like Egyptians. Their skin was darker, their physiognomy that of the Sudan, end quote. Yahuwshah adds, the Cushite rulers are depicted with darker chocolate brown color than the reddish-brown Egyptians in the wall paintings of the Temple of Taharka at Qasr Ibrim, and also on a papyrus fragment. The confusion arises among fake black Israelites of today because they see ancient art and statues of these 6 temporary Negro foreign rulers, or general artwork of Negroes who were a small minority in ancient Egypt, and then they falsely conclude that all ancient Egyptians must have been Negro. However, as we've demonstrated, this is incorrect. The ancient Egyptian word for their land was Kemet, which means the black. Fake black Israelites claim this is because the skin color of the ancient Egyptians was allegedly black. However, Egyptologist Herman Keyes notes, the black, fertile soil gave Egypt its name Kemet, the black. The word does not have anything to do with skin color. Likewise, Professor of Old Testament Robert A. Bennett confirms, Egypt referred to herself as the Black Land, Keme, alluding to the rich mud from the Nile inundations. The ever-encroaching desert was called the Red Land, Dashre, end quote. Another way fake black Israelites try to show the ancient Egyptians were Negro is they appeal to the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC. In his work, The History of Herodotus, he says people called the Colchians were Egyptians. Colchians were people who lived in what today is the country Georgia. Then fake black Israelites argue Herodotus described the Colchians as Negroes. Herodotus wrote, for the people of Colchis are evidently Egyptian, and this I perceived for myself before I hear it from others. They are dark-skinned and have curly hair. This of itself amounts to nothing, for there are other races which are so, but also still more because the Colchians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians alone, of all the races of men, have practiced circumcision from the first. However, Herodotus was not the most reliable when it came to his descriptions of other people's ethnic features. Consider his inaccurate claim that the semen of Indians and Ethiopians was black, like the color of their skin. Secondly, he was probably not even describing Colchians as Negroes. As historian of ancient Egypt, Simpson Najavitz observes, had Herodotus wanted to designate the Colchians as blacks, and by extension designate the Egyptians as blacks, he would have named the Colchians by the standard Greek term Atho and Aethiops, scorched faces, Ethiopians. This is precisely what he did on several other occasions when he wanted to indicate that a people was of the black race. or what he thought was the black race. But not only did not he name the Colchians as Ethiopians, in the same sentence, he once again distinguished between Egyptians and Ethiopians. In another quote from the same work, Herodotus refutes the idea the Nile River rose because of melting snow. He notes the Nile begins in places like modern Libya and Ethiopia, which are extremely hot, and then it travels to Egypt, and thus snow could not exist in hot places where the Nile originates. Fake black Israelites falsely claim he describes Egyptians as Negro here. Herodotus wrote, "This way has no more truth in it than the rest, alleging as it does that the Nile flows from melting snow, whereas it flows out of Libya through the midst of the Ethiopians, and so comes out into Egypt. How then should it flow from snow when it flows from the hottest parts to those which are cooler? The people dwelling there, who are of a black color by reason of the burning heat." On this quote, fake black Israelites are incorrect. It is clear that here Herodotus is describing the Libyans and Ethiopians as being black from the burning heat, since they are from the area where the Nile flows from. That is the area where it would be impossible for snow to form, the Nile River. He's not talking about Egypt, since the Nile does not flow from there, but instead, as he says, the Nile starts where it is burning hot, that is Libya and Ethiopia, and then travels to where it is cooler, that is Egypt. Proponents of fake black Israelism, Anu Mbantu and Gert Muller, falsely claim that ivory heads from the Phos temple in Lachish prove, quote, "The ancient Hebrews were clearly black without question in hair and face." However, the ivory heads in question do not depict Hebrews or Israelites. The Phos temple is actually a pagan Canaanite temple dated to the 15th or 16th century BC. At that period, the Canaanites lived in Lachish. The Israelites did not live there until the 10th century BC. Hence, these temple statuettes were not created by Israelites. So when these authors lie and use pictures of the Phos temple ivory heads as evidence the Israelites were black, and even put pictures of them on the cover of their book as evidence, that is highly deceptive. This movement is based on lies and has no concern for truth. Anu Mbantu and Gert Muller also claim Genesis 28:11 proves Jacob was a Negro, because in that text Jacob allegedly used stones for pillows, which, according to them, would only work if Jacob had an afro to help lend further support. They claim this verse proves Jacob's hair was similar to that of the sub-Saharans, Africans. However, the text does not mention an afro, and based on the Hebrew text, many Old Testament scholars and translations affirm that Jacob used the stone not as a pillow, but instead as protection or self-defense, and placed it near his head in case he had to wake up and use it as a weapon and fight, or as a makeshift enclosure for his head for protection. The Hebrew word is mera asata, and many Old Testament scholars and translations translate it as he put it at his head place, as opposed to some who translate it as he put them for pillows. Old Testament scholar Victor P. Hamilton gives evidence for our reading. The same word occurs in verse 18, which says of mera asat, place at the head, head place. In addition to verse 18, see 1 Samuel 19:13, 16, 26:7, 1 Kings 19:6. The stone more likely served as protection for his head rather than as a pillow. See 1 Samuel 26:7, where Saul sleeps in a trench with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. Now, Anu Mbantu and Gert Muller also claim the Leviticus 13 leprosy laws show that the ancient Israelites had black skin. They argue, the complexions white, and somewhat dark are contrasted with the Hebrew complexion because they are bright in relation. We are thus told that the Hebrews were neither white, nor somewhat dark. They're claiming since leprosy was said to cause discernible white spots, dark white spots, and somewhat dark spots, that must mean the skin color of the ancient Israelite was black and not any of these colors. Otherwise, such leprosy could not be detectable. However, due to the texture of leprosy, it's quite easy to detect on the human body, even if the color of the leprosy patch is the same as the color of the human body. So this argument holds no weight. A somewhat dark Middle Eastern brown Israelite could spot leprous, somewhat dark skin disease, even though it was the same color as them. Also, when verse 28 correlates the quote-unquote bright spot with the quote-unquote somewhat dark skin disease, this does not mean the somewhat dark skin disease was brighter than the Israelites' normal skin. That is, that the Israelites' skin must have been darker than quote-unquote somewhat dark. This is an erroneous argument, since the original Hebrew word sometimes rendered as bright spot here is ha-baheret, and the NET Bible's notes explains it actually means shiny spot or white spot. But to render this term white spot in this chapter would create redundancy, end quote. Thus, the fake black Israelite argument holds no weight. Fake black Israelites also appeal to Job 30:30, which in the King James says, "My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burnt with heat." However, the context here is Job suffering after being tested by God. When he says his skin is black upon him, the original Hebrew text refers to disease causing Job's skin to rot and fall off. The majority text says, "Become dark from upon me," end quote. It is not saying he was naturally black. That's why the ESV renders it as, "My skin turns black and falls from me." This is referring to the effects of the leprous boils Job was inflicted with in Job chapter 2. As Old Testament scholar Franz Delitzsch notes, for the first time he speaks of his disfigurement by leprosy in particular. "My skin is become black from me," i.e. being become black has peeled from me, end quote. Indeed, his skin was rotting off. Job 2:7-8 talks about Job being inflicted with disease, whereby he used broken pottery to scrape off his rotting skin. That is all that is being talked about. It is not saying he was a Negro. Fake black Israelites also misuse Song of Solomon 1:5-6 and claim that it shows Solomon was a Negro. It says, "I am black, but calmly, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me, because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards," end quote. However, here Solomon's wife is speaking, not Solomon. Moreover, it clearly says she was black because of suntan, not that she was naturally black. The reason she was so suntanned was because she had to work the vineyards for her brothers, verse 6. Thus, this is referring to suntan and not a Negro complexion. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew verb shazaf, which means to look at, points to the woman personifying the sun as looking at her too long, thereby burning her skin. If you are born black, you don't need to be tanned by the sun to become blackened. An interesting text to discuss is Lamentations 4:7-8 and 5:10. Her princes were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their bodies were more ruddy than coral. The beauty of their form was like sapphire. Now their face is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as wood. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. The context here is the distress of the Jews after the fall and destruction of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BC. This happened because of the immorality of the Jews. The text in question gives a contrast to how the nobles and commoners used to be, compared to how they were after the fall. Old Testament scholar F.B. Huey notes the descriptions are dramatic hyperbole. When the people were not in sin and destruction, they were symbolically described as purer than snow and whiter than milk, verse 7. Then after their sin and destruction, they are described as having faces blacker than soot and not being recognizable in the streets, verse 8. This is clearly all symbolic exaggeration, denoting their extreme plight. Moreover, if we take it literally and affirm the people were actually turned black, why would they not be recognized in the streets, as verse 8 says? Wasn't black the color of all the Israelites naturally? The fact is, just as verse 8's description of their skin becoming as dry as wood is just a dramatic exaggeration, so is the description of their faces becoming blacker than soot, verse 8, or their skin becoming black like an oven, 5:10. The text is full of symbolism and exaggeration due to plight, and so to try to draw out literal descriptions of natural skin color is erroneous. Another text these groups abuse and misunderstand is Jeremiah 14:2, which says, Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish. They are black unto the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. The problem is the usual Hebrew word for black, i.e. shakor, isn't even used here. Instead, the word kadar is. Here this word refers to mourning in black clothing, that is the dress of a mourner, as the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew and English lexicon puts it. This was ancient Israel's custom, where they covered themselves with black sackcloth and ashes when mourning. As Old Testament scholar Charles L. Feinberg notes concerning this verse, the nation is clothed in black to express its mourning, end quote. Thus, the blackness here has nothing to do with skin color. Although fake black Israelites point to certain Egyptian art and claim the men and women have Negro hair, the fact is the ancient Egyptians wore specialized wigs, often braided wigs, and these groups confuse them with Negro hair. However, as the work Historical Wig Styling confirms, like Egyptian women, Egyptian men usually shaved their heads and wore wigs. Likewise, the work Empire of Ancient Egypt confirms, long braided wigs were very fashionable among the wealthy women of ancient Egypt. Both books provide ancient illustrations of such wigs to prove the point. Evidence Christ was not a Negro can be found in a fairly recent forensic anthropological study conducted by scientists and archaeologists such as expert in ancient facial reconstruction Richard Neve of the University of Manchester. Neve has helped reconstruct the faces of many ancient persons, including King Midas of 2000 BC, Nesyaman the Egyptian mummy of 1100 BC, and Philip II of Macedon of 400 BC. The study took note of the fact that Jesus looked like an average Galilean Semite, based on Matthew 26's discussion of Jesus' arrest. They then gathered ancient skulls from Jerusalem in order to study and determine the facial features of people of Jesus' time and area. They used various scientific techniques to create a 3D face. For example, they were able to accurately recreate the muscles and skin over the skull using forensic computer techniques. To determine Jesus' hair and skin color, they consulted relevant ancient art of Israelites. The study revealed that Jesus would have been an average-looking brown-skinned Middle Eastern Jew, and not a Negro. In the year 2000, James Tabar and archaeologist Shimon Gibson discovered a 1st century tomb just south of Jerusalem, and in it they found 1st century male Jewish hair. It is not Negro hair, but instead medium to short, straight, reddish hair. This again helps demonstrate the ancient Jews at Jesus' time were not Negroes. Moreover, Professor of Hebrew Literature Shay J.D. Cohen notes, Jews and Gentiles in antiquity were corporally, visually, linguistically, and socially indistinguishable. Even the sages of the Rabbinic Academy could not discern Romans in their midst. This means at the time of Christ, fair-skinned Romans could not be distinguished from the Jews. Thus, the ancient Israelites could not have been Negro. Cohen's source to prove this is the Sephra on Deuteronomy, codified around AD 300. This source reports a much earlier tradition that at the time of Rabbi Gamaliel in the 1st century AD, 2 Roman soldiers pretended to be Jews as inspectors and joined Gamaliel's Jewish school. Ancient Orthodox Jews, however, believed teaching Torah to Gentiles was forbidden, and so the Roman soldiers must have visually blended in with these Jews at the school. The fact the ancient Orthodox Jews believed associating and visiting with Gentiles was forbidden is also confirmed in Acts 10:28. This material further demonstrates the ancient Jews at the time and location of Jesus were not Negro.
Christ is a black man.
Wait a minute.
So what the hell is wrong with you black men and women out there?
Give me a minute.
Christ is a black man?
Elisha J. Israel writes, probably the most telling indication of the color of Israel is John the Revelator's description of Jesus' hair texture and skin color. Jesus was and is dark-skinned. The text reads, his head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, his eyes like a flame of fire, his feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. However, these are not literal descriptions. Revelation 1:12-16 is a highly symbolic apocalyptic vision of Christ. Firstly, in regards to Jesus being described as having feet like fine brass, this is symbolic, and the meaning has roots in ancient Israelite culture. It is not a literal description of skin color. In the same verse, Christ's voice is said to be like the sound of many waters, and his eyes like fire. Just as these descriptions are not literal but symbolic, Jesus does not have literal feet like brass. Instead, New Testament and classic scholar Craig S. Keener, who has a black wife by the way, and New Testament scholar Robert Mounts both note that in ancient Jewish understanding, limbs being described as bronze or brass just symbolically denoted glory, strength, and stability, and had nothing to do with actual skin tone. Moreover, the brass or bronze does not symbolize black skin, since verse 15 says the brass was as if refined in a furnace. When metals are refined in a furnace, they are glowing red or yellow, not black. In regards to Jesus' hair being described as white like wool, those who claim this refers to Negro hair miss the point. New Testament scholar Alan F. Johnson notes the reason Jesus' hair is described in this manner is because ancient Eastern countries believed aged or hoary grayish-white hair represented wisdom and dignity, and the animal that had pure white hair they could point to as a symbol was the sheep, which produced pure white wool. That's why the picture of woolly hair was used for Christ. Sheep's wool was the best example of pure white hair representing wisdom. It has nothing to do with Jesus having Negro hair. To further prove Revelation 1:14-15 is symbolic and not literal, in the very next verse in Revelation 1:16, Jesus is said to have a sword coming from his mouth. The same verse also says Jesus' face is like the sun, shining in full strength. Are we to take these things literally too? If we were, this must mean that Jesus was yellow or white, since that is the color of the sun shining in full strength, not black. Now, some fake black Israelites falsely claim a 3rd or 4th century Good Shepherd painting of Jesus from the Roman catacombs looks Negroid. However, this is a fallacious argument. Scholars of early Christian art note there are over 80 of these Good Shepherd fresco paintings in the Roman catacombs, where Jesus is holding a lamb on his shoulders. For example, the Good Shepherd painting in the St. Callisto catacomb in Rome from the 3rd century depicts Jesus as an average-looking brown-skinned Middle Eastern Jew and not a Negro. So it's disingenuous for fake black Israelites to pick 1 or 2 paintings out of 80 or so others in order to argue their case. Fake black Israelites also claim a painting from the catacombs of St. Domitilla showed Jesus and the apostles were Negroid as well. However, upon close examination, their facial features do not actually appear Negro. Plus, there's another one called the Bust of Christ ceiling fresco in the catacombs of Comedilla in Rome that depicts Jesus as light-skinned. So why the selective appeal of only a few catacomb frescoes when there are over 80, many of which clearly contradict their argument? Most fake black Israelites are King James onlyists, even though this position has been refuted in many high-level academic works by people like Carson, Price, and White. But what is truly strange is the claim of the fake black Israelites that the man who authorized this translation, King James I, was a black Hebrew Israelite. The problem is, we have portraits of King James painted by people who knew him, proving he was white. For example, we have the paintings of John de Critz, who, shortly after King James I became king in 1603, was appointed to be one of his portrait painters. When we examine Critz's eyewitness portraits, we clearly see King James was not a Negro. Moreover, we know from early paintings of King James' parents, Mary Queen of Scots and Henry Stuart, that they were Caucasian and not Negro either. So, what is the evidence fake black Israelites use to claim King James was a black guy? Firstly, they use a distorted, compressed, and blurry version of a painting of King James by Hendrik Hondius from 1608. However, if you look at the unedited, clear original painting, it is obvious King James was not black. The original I am using was provided by the reputable art website, Mutual Art. Notice in the original he has straight hair and Caucasian facial features. Also, although fake black Israelites falsely claim the word Jacobus in this painting means King James was descended from the biblical Jacob and was thus part of the tribe of Judah, the fact is the reason the painting says Jacobus V is because the painter Hendrik Hondius was Dutch, and the Dutch way of spelling James is Jacobus V. It has nothing to do with the biblical Jacob or the tribe of Judah. He was just spelling King James's name in Dutch. Fake black Israelites also appeal to the picture of King James on the cover of Thomas Hobbes' 1651 book, Leviathan. However, this is not an eyewitness picture. Moreover, upon close examination, King James does not even look Negro. He even has a handlebar mustache and wavy long hair, not an afro. Lastly, they appeal to a picture of King James in the 1616 book, Works of King James. However, anyone who thinks this is a black man has serious eye problems. Here King James has a handlebar mustache and straight hair as well. This is clearly an old white guy. As supposed evidence African Americans are the true Israelites, fake black Israelites claim the Deuteronomy 28 curses apply to African Americans. Deuteronomy 28 affirms curses would be brought upon Israel if it was disobedient and violated the Mosaic covenant. The curses include and relate to death, slavery, slave ships, Egypt, labor work, occupation, famine, and Israelites dispersing throughout the world, etc. Fake black Israelites falsely claim Deuteronomy 28:68 predicts the transatlantic slave trade of the African Americans. However, there are many problems with this position. Firstly, the Deuteronomy 28:36 curse was that the Israelites would be brought with their king to a foreign nation if they disobeyed. Africans were not brought to America with a king. On the other hand, during the Assyrian captivity of the 10 tribes of Israel in 722 BC, the Israelite king Hoshea was taken captive with the Israelites. Also, when Babylon sieged Jerusalem and exiled the people of Judah in 586 BC, the Judite king of Israel, Zedekiah, was also exiled and brought with the Israelites. Thus, Deuteronomy 28:36 was fulfilled by the ancient Judeans and Israelites, not African Americans. Secondly, Scripture actually tells us this is when the Deuteronomy 28 curses were fulfilled, since referring to the Babylonian captivity, Zechariah 1:6, for example, says the Lord's commandments, quote-unquote, took over the Israelites. The Hebrew word for took over here is nasag, and it's the same word used in Deuteronomy 28:15 and 45, when mentioning how the Israelites' failure to obey God's commands would lead to the Israelites being took over by curses, same word used. This shows the Babylonian captivity was the fulfillment of the Deuteronomy 28 curses. Thirdly, referring to the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and captivity in the 6th century BC. Lamentations 4:10 mentions how the Israelites were starving so bad they ate their own children.
Hold on.
This
people.
fulfills the
I'm gonna
curse
pause
in
this
Deuteronomy 28.
so you can hear this.